All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen.
It is clear the 2020 election was a grave betrayal of American democracy.
We have a breach of the Capitol! Breach of the Capitol!
Take back control of huge sums of money, of £350 million a week, and spend it on our priorities.
І раджу скласти зброю і повернутися до своїх сімей.
It took me about a year with Sandy Hook to come to grips with the fact that the whole thing was fake.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Williams. I'm a former executive from Reuters and the BBC, a former journalist. I think as it says up there, I'm at Edelman. I'm running a big chunk of Edelman's global advisory business. But actually, more importantly for the topic of this discussion this afternoon, I'm a board member of the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the panel that you've got in front of you today. These are not budget holders or boss class. These are the experts. They are in the digital trenches trying to figure out how we navigate the world of AI, disinformation, misinformation, bad actors, and doing it, I think, with extraordinary courage and with great innovation. And I'm very pleased that we've got such an extraordinary cast in front of us. So let me quickly introduce them. To my left, I've got Madhumita Murgia, who is the FT's first ever, I think I'm right in saying, AI editor. Another first, Marianna Spring, to my left, the BBC's first disinformation and social media correspondent. And then next to her, Fisayo Soyombo, who is the founder editor of the Foundation for Investigative Journalism in Nigeria. And then finally, Bob Trafford, who is the Assistant Director of Forensic Architecture, which is a research group that uses architectural techniques to investigate state violence and human rights violations around the world. So look, I'm going to come to each of you one by one, and then if we've got time in the 24 minutes or 25 minutes that we've got for additional questions, we'll do that. Madhu, can I come to you first on a topic that we're reading about on a daily basis, generative AI. So this is the technology that uses human prompts to create, I don't want to say original images and text because they're new, they come from existing source material. How big an impact is generative AI going to have on journalism, do you think?
So the two questions I get asked the most about AI is it going to take over the world? And what's it going to do to journalism? These are the two things that people care about, it seems, the most. I think, seeing what generative AI does, which is write plausible text and generate images which seem unique and original, is really close to what we do as journalists. And I think it's why it's kind of top of mind for everybody in this room, probably, and lots that I talk to. On the opportunity side, having played around with it, you can see the power of something that can digest huge amounts of information, pull out summaries, pull out themes and ideas. It's a good assistant, right, to the work that we're trying to do. But the risks are huge that go with it. And I think, the rest of the panelists here will have lots to say about that. There is the risk of it making up things. In the world of computer science, they call it hallucinations, but really that's just a word for fabrications. As we learn more how the technology works, we realize that there's very little basis in fact, in terms of what it's generating. It's just predicting what it thinks the next most likely word in a sentence is. So there's the dangers of it flooding flooding the information ecosystem, the public square, with things that aren't true, and people can't tell the difference between real and false images and text because it sounds so plausible. But on the other side, it can be, a very sort of powerful assistant for the sort of investigative digging and the on-the-ground reporting that we all try to do.
And academics like David Rosado have actually looked at some of the kind of source material in the LLM of ChatGPT and actually concluded that actually some of the answers are more left-leaning than they are right-leaning. So presumably that could be a problem if you're essentially having ChatGPT do a lot of the research for you.
Yeah, so it's, these algorithms, we don't know what they're trained on because there's very little transparency from companies like OpenAI on what the source material, as you call it, is. We do know that it's trained on masses of the internet, places like Reddit and other forums, which aren't moderated, aren't fact-checked, and so on. So you can only sort of imagine the sort of the vibe of the things that this is being trained on. Yes, there have been examples of political bias, also gender bias, when it assumes genders for doctors versus nurses, assistants versus CEOs. And so that's something we have to be very cognizant of if we start publishing or using this to kind of filter the work that we do.
So we've heard leaders from Reuters, from the BBC. We heard Barry Diller talk about AI in the session around lunchtime. But it seems clear to me that actually it's the tech firms that are doing the front running here versus media companies, right? There's also been a lot of talk about having a sort of moratoria on AI, halting for 6 months to let the rest of the world, ethicists and others, consider actually what's the right path forward. Is that at all feasible?
In my view, that's not going to happen. Tech companies are already all racing each other to see who can put this into the hands of consumers as quickly as possible. They have the money, the data, and the technical expertise needed to do it while nobody else does. Just later today, Google is going to have a whole raft of new announcements around its search product. And, this whole race has been taken out of the hands of sort of the rest of us, and it's become a commercial race, really. And so we can't stop it. The question now is how we learn to live with it, but in a way that there are guardrails in place, in a way that we can make sure there's trust in what is being put out there, and also to figure out what is our role in a world where there's going to be content farms generated with hundreds of these articles, which already has been seen.
Yeah, that's a big change, right? In the past, if you were Vladimir Putin, you might have 1,000 or so people sitting in a troll farm in St. Petersburg. Now all the work can be done for you via AI.
Yeah, there was a study from NewsGuard, 49 websites they found, which were all just AI generated. One of them actually had a thing saying, I'm an AI and my ethics prevents me from writing misinformation about vaccines. And they just published that as an article. So this is happening already.
So Marianna, that's the kind of supply side. Talk to me a little bit about the demand side, because a lot of the work you've been doing is looking at the groups of people who are consuming, sharing, amplifying this content. What do we know about them?
Absolutely. And actually, while I do spend a lot of time looking at the victims, the people targeted by disinformation or hate on social media, I think it's so vital that we really enter those conspiracy worlds, often full of hate and mistruths, and understand the people who are the true believers, the people who are the followers of these movements. And that can come with some risks. Often these movements are quite hostile, but on the whole, I've found them to be a really sort of positive way of understanding more and ultimately applying the principles of investigative journalism to that social media world, the same ones that a lot of people have spoken about today. I think that there's one example that really stays with me. A woman called Alicia who lives in Wales, and she followed someone who we're going to talk about next, I think, a man called Richard D. Hall, and she was consuming his content, including content suggesting that the Manchester Arena bombing had been staged or fabricated in some way. And I interviewed her for a Panorama investigation, Disaster Deniers Hunting the Trolls, and a Radio 4 podcast series of the same name. And she welcomed me into her home and we started talking. And I often find the most important thing is to understand not what people believe so much as why they believe it. And for her, she had found the pandemic very difficult. She'd lost her mum. It had been a really anxious time. She was finding the cost of living crisis even more difficult. And she turned to this place as a kind of a place for answers. She found it really quite terrifying, and that had gripped her. She was using social media as the gateway to this world. And so she'd found herself consuming these kinds of conspiracy theories that actually, when I kind of confronted her, she said, oh, hang on a second, maybe I've gone too far. And I spoke to her about the survivors and the victims. And in some ways, that was quite a hopeful encounter, because I left thinking that actually perhaps her views weren't so deeply held as we might think, and that actually some of the people who are the true believers who've been exploited or misled, that there is hope if we can actually expose to them how these tactics work and how the leaders of these movements are misleading them.
It's a really interesting point. I remember Marianna a few years ago doing a focus group in the north of England and asking people about their media consumption habits. And there was a very, very bright woman who worked in one of the big companies up there who was talking about her consumption of RT. And how RT, provided a news diet that was very different to the BBC, stories that you wouldn't find elsewhere. And she, it's quite extraordinary. When I asked her, what does RT stand for? She had absolutely no idea. So a lot of this is also inadvertent. But look, you talked about your investigation into the conspiracy theorist Richard Hall, who claimed the Manchester Arena victims were actors. They were faking it. I think we've got a clip, actually. Can we play that?
Okay, so I've made a slight improvement to the surveillance device.
This might look ridiculous, but here Richard Hall talks about putting a camera outside the home of Eve Hibbert, who was severely injured in the Manchester Arena bombing. Hall says he wants to see if her injuries are real. Eve almost died. Her father Martin was also badly injured.
I wish I could just get the picture of me and he, literally, me on the floor with just this big pool of blood around me. To see that, it shut him up.
Tell me a bit about Richard Hall, his beliefs, where he came from.
So Richard D. Hall is someone who has grown a decent online following by promoting mistruths around terror attacks, around the pandemic, lots of other topics. And it's his conspiracy theories around the Manchester Arena attack, which I was looking at predominantly, and the suggestion that people were acting or they'd somehow fake their injuries. And what was the most shocking, aside from the fact that he'd written an entire book kind of detailing these claims, which he sells and still continues to try and sell online. But that he was using tactics in the real world to kind of further these conspiracy theories. So as you saw there, he was filming himself allegedly putting this camera outside of Eve's home. It later turned out, and he admitted to us, that he'd left a camera rolling in a van parked outside her home. And as I explained there, Eve was left severely disabled after that attack. And for Martin and Eve, it was just so shocking. It left them feeling really frightened. There was another woman called Lisa who he secretly filmed at her place of work to see whether she was lying about her injuries. And when I interviewed her, she had not put any makeup on her face. And she said, I really want to make sure that he can see the scars that have been left, because for these people, they've lived through the worst ever. To then have that denied, I think tells you the depths that denial have reached here in the UK, and just how extreme and harmful that can become. And it echoes Alex Jones, which I'm sure a lot of people in the room have heard about, and the playbook that people are now using and succeeding in some ways. And interestingly, in comparing it to Alex Jones, now Martin Hibbert has decided to take legal action against Hall. He's suing him for defamation and also harassment, and seeking damages like those Sandy Hook parents. That's the shooting that happened over in the States, yes, that Jones denied. At the time, I tried to interview Hall. I wanted to speak to him. I went to the market stall where he was selling this book, and I confronted him. I asked him questions from the survivors because he hadn't given me any answers. He told me I was wrong about how he operated. And has continued to double down on these conspiracy theories around the Manchester Arena attack. And that's a very upfront way, I guess, that I deal with disinformation and the social media world in the real world. But then there's also, I think, an important thing we have to talk about, the way that we deal with, the way that we can also investigate social media through people's feeds and kind of undercover accounts and other ways, not just in person, but online.
Okay, can we move over to Fisayo? Because you go undercover as well, but you, if I may say, there's undercover and there's deep undercover. We'll come to that in a second, but can you just Talk to us a little bit about why you've chosen this method for uncovering the truth.
Thank you. My method is a product of the country that I operate in, Nigeria. So if you want to speak truth to power, you want to hold the rich and powerful in the private sector to account, you want to expose wrongdoing, you will hit a brick wall at some point in time. Nigeria does have a freedom of information law signed by former President Goodluck Jonathan in 2011. But guess what? 6 years after, when a media NGO called Media Rights Agenda did a survey of the number one violators of that law, the presidency was number one. The government that signed that law, never honored it. You have judges on that list, prominent government organizations. So if you want to rely on the FOI law to get information in Nigeria, you're not going to achieve any result. And for that reason, I then thought I could simulate situations and then experience things firsthand. So my method is not really to say I'm who I'm not. It's to go to the agency I'm interested in investigating and then simulate something that happens. E.g., a psychiatric hospital. So I will be a patient here, and I did that before. Spent 10 days in a psychiatric hospital, and then I had to report on it. So I'm not asking anyone questions because I saw it live.
So you actually experience what it's like. So give me talk to me a little bit about the Nigerian criminal justice system and how you exposed the rot, if you like, heart of that. How do you go about doing that?
The target was actually the prison. I'd heard that a lot was happening in Nigerian prisons, so I wanted to go in and report firsthand. As a matter of fact, I titled my pitch for that project, Reverse Prison Break. People in prison...
You're breaking in.
Yes.
Right.
Because people in prison want to break out. I wanted to break in. But the police was then the avenue. So pretend like an offense had been committed, get the police to pick me up, and then send me to jail. By Nigerian laws, in 24 hours, I had to be out of police custody. They kept me for 5 days. Every single morning, they woke me up to ask me if there was someone to pay bribes to get me out. So I found out a lot about Nigerian police, even though they were not the original target. Then from there, they took me to court. In court, people were coming to meet me. After the magistrate remanded me in prison, if you can pay, you will sleep in your house tonight, which means in the Nigerian justice system, once you have money, two things. If you have money and your case is not under media spotlight, you escape justice. So a court sits and they say, send him to jail. But he pays a bribe right in court, and he sleeps in his house. And the media reports he's in jail, and people celebrate. But you're never going to find that because you can't write to a court. You can't write to a Nigerian prison and say, give us a list of how many inmates you have. You're not going to get an answer. And then in prison, I then found out that you can go to prison in Nigeria and get your records erased. Just speak to the right people and pay them. You can drink, you can do drugs, you can have sex, you can sleep in air-conditioned rooms, you can live the big man life if you can pay and if you know the right people. And I thought it doesn't help with democracy if we allow a system to continue to let people get away with the law, do what they like and just get away with it.
But Fisayo, you were then uncovered, right?
Yeah.
What happened?
So the plan was for me to be in prison for a while, and then afterwards, someone from my team would bring in a hidden device for me to record and get hard evidence. Because again, if you write without evidence, they say it's a lie. So I wanted evidence. But from court, they were already asking me for bribes. And they were saying that once I arrived at the prison, if I could pay, they would give me special accommodation, and I would enjoy my time in prison. So I changed the plan at the last minute, and then I tried to go in with the camera because I wanted to record how at the prison entrance, they were going to collect money from me to give me the good life accommodation. But my cover was blown. They found the camera on me, and then they asked who I was. But I thought if I said I was a journalist, that was the end of the story. By the way, I had spent 5 crazy nights in the police cell. Anyone who knows about Nigerian police system does not want to sleep there for one night. Because one night into that experience, I woke up in the middle of the night and I asked myself, who sent me? So I couldn't then get to prison and then say I was a journalist, and that was the end of the story. And again, I thought it's easy to sit down behind the screen and write about values, about courage, about sacrifice. But when push comes to shove, are you going to be there to stand up and be counted? And I thought that was my opportunity. So I didn't tell them I was a journalist. He held me to buy 24 hours, during which I saw the corruption in Nigerian prison from the process of registration. The person trying to document you as a prisoner is asking you for bribes. From the very start to the very end. I wouldn't have seen it if I told them I was a journalist. But because I didn't talk, they beat me up. I think you have a picture if you show it.
We do.
This is a picture of me 3 weeks after I was beaten up. So imagine what it was like on the night that it happened. So they stripped me of all my clothing, beat the hell out of me, cane going straight into my flesh. And then afterwards, they brought a big stick and they were targeting my joints, my elbows, my shoulders, my knees, my ankles, just the joints too. And I thought it was just the price I had to pay to get a story, one, and then to release a landmark story about the problems of the Nigerian criminal justice system, so that just in case any government wanted to help, then they had the right lead.
So Fisayo, we will obviously, hats off, it's an extraordinary piece of work, and we will remember you as the man who broke into a prison. It's an extraordinary claim and an amazing, as I say, incredibly brave, extraordinary piece of journalism. I want to talk about... I want to talk about getting at the truth via digital tools, and Robert Trafford has very patiently been waiting at the end to talk about forensic architecture, which we were discussing earlier. I sort of tried to summarize as a digital time machine. You kind of use open source information, OSINT, alongside other accessible data, plus eyewitness accounts to build a three-dimensional picture of an event in time. Could you, for the audience, just describe, probably a little bit better than I've just done, exactly what you do at Forensic Architecture and what kind of stories you're focusing on?
I will do, and I'll try and do it quickly. So we're a university research agency. Those of you who are familiar with the New York Times Visual Investigations team, the visual forensics teams at the Washington Post will be familiar with the aesthetic of our kind of work. We use digital models as a venue for all kinds of different digital evidence. Beginning with images and videos, because I think it's images and videos that have created much of the era that we live in today, particularly with respect to post-truth, as we're here to discuss. And we're really interested in the post-truth, as practiced by states. We investigate police, militaries, secret services. In a sense, we're kind of investigators for hire for civil society. And often we see in our work, which spans the globe, we work from Goldsmiths, University of London, actually in southeast London, but we work with organizations and frontline communities all around the world who are suffering state violence, repression, and we often realize that violence comes with a second violence as well, and that's the violence of denial and cover-up and disinformation and fabrication, the kind of continued violence which prevents communities from healing, from repairing, and also from experiencing accountability. And it's that second violence that we feel that we can disrupt, that we can really disrupt the sort of power asymmetry that creates this luxury for states to lie and fabricate around human rights cases.
So should we have a look at some of your work, which is the reconstruction of the fatal shooting that happened actually it's a year ago tomorrow, of the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. I think we've got a short
Always
video.
much easier to see rather than hear what we do.
Indeed. If we could play the video, please.
It is at this moment when we see Shireen on the ground for the first time. Through information from exclusive access to Shireen's autopsy report, we precisely reconstructed her position when shot and the bullet's point of impact. We also identified and reconstructed the precise position of the Israeli forces 3 minutes before the shooting. The front and back vehicles are positioned sideways, so that its shooting hole here is directed towards the street. The bullet retrieved from Shireen's head has a green tip. Open source research confirms this munition, distinct by its accuracy, is commonly used by IOF marksmen. This is the opening for the scope. We simulated how Shireen and the other journalists would appear from the marksman's position 190 meters away. According to the model, this is what the marksman would have seen when they began shooting. The journalists' press vests would have been clearly visible here and throughout the incident. The close proximity of the 6 known shots that hit Shireen, Ali, and the tree confirms a professional marksman repeatedly and explicitly targeted the journalists. We traced the trajectory of these 6 shots from the vehicle. All shots were aimed above the shoulders and intended to kill.
So it's a really extraordinary piece of work, and I'd encourage everyone to watch the full video, which is available online. What was the impact of that investigation, Robert?
So those of you who are familiar with the story of Shireen's killing will know that the official picture of what happened there, let's say repeatedly and in various ways, began to fall apart. Initially, the story was that there had been crossfire and it was likely that Palestinian militants had killed Shireen. We were able, although we were not the only ones, to show that the video that had been offered by the Israeli state as evidence for that claim had actually been shot about a dozen blocks away and was nothing to do with the incident. And this precisely is the second violence that I'm talking about. We were able to go much further than the visual investigations teams that had also studied this work, precisely because of the architectural techniques that are within our toolkit. And we were able to show, as the video demonstrates there, a measure of intentionality that other techniques weren't able to capture. And so we were able to contribute to a further collapse of that story. And as we now know, the Israeli state accepts that there was a very strong likelihood that it was their responsibility. That work has not only affected the discourse online and in the public domain, but that work has also been submitted to the ICC and to a number of other investigations of which are ongoing.
Interesting. I want to squeeze one last question in, and it's probably to Madhu and Marianna, and it's the question around how news organizations and newsrooms are able to verify information in the world of AI and generative AI and AGI and the risks associated with that. And if you could be really brief in your answers, if that is possible, but how the hell do you go about verifying information? What does sourcing look like in the future?
So I think it will be easier for images compared to text, and there are a range of people working on watermarking AI-generated images. Google is thinking about how it will watermark everything its AI generates to set a precedent for everybody else to do the same. So it will be the technology, but also the practice that everybody has to adopt. Text will be a lot harder because unless it says, sorry, I'm an AI and I can't answer your question, it's very hard to know why the words are not human. There are some tools today. OpenAI has a tool, but it only says it's about 20% accurate even on its own models of ChatGPT. So I think it will be about public education, learning when to trust and who to trust, the kind of old-fashioned ways of verifying information rather than only looking to a technological solution.
And you'd agree with that, Marianna?
Yeah, I'd echo everything Madhu said, really. And I think that it's so vital that newsrooms across the board kind of invest in expertise in disinformation and investigating social media in particular, because it's by exposing how this works, how the tactics work, how people are harmed, the real world impact it can have, and just really unpicking it that audiences understand how it works and can apply those same skills in what they're doing. And that's sort of like how the battle continues.
Well, thank you very much. It's an amazing session. I mean, we've covered a lot and we could be here all afternoon, but thank you.